The inventory sheet listed 47 rooms. Charlotte Vale counted 49. She stood in the entrance hall of Ashmore Park on a Tuesday in early November, holding a clipboard whose edge had left a faint red crease along the inside of her left palm, and she did not move for a long moment, while the solicitor's man explained to her, with the particular courtesy of someone performing an obligation he found distasteful, that certain areas of the house were sealed by the master's own direction and were not to be included in the estate assessment. His name was Prentice. He smiled when he said it. He had the kind of smile that arrived slightly before the words did, as though the expression were a calling card for a sentiment he had not yet bothered to compose. Charlotte noted the smile, noted the sealed rooms, wrote the number 49 in the margin of her sheet beside the printed 47, and said nothing. Outside, the November sky pressed down on the grounds with the weight of something waterlogged, and the long oak avenue leading from the lane to the front steps held its last few leaves, the way a person holds a thing they have already decided to let go of. The house itself was vast and square and the color of an old tooth. Prentice had told her, in the car from the station, that the late Lord Ashmore had not lived here in 8 years, that the property was now administered by a trust, and that a sale was expected by spring. He had told her this in the tone of someone telling her that the weather was likely to remain unsettled. He had not asked her opinion. Charlotte Vale had been appraising inherited estates and their contents for 11 years, and in that time she had learned that the sealed room is almost always the room that matters. She did not say this to Prentice. She wrote it nowhere. She thought it, in the particular way she allowed herself to think things she intended to act upon, not as an emotion but as a notation, recorded in a private column and set aside until the appropriate moment. Prentice showed her to the drawing room, where a man sat behind a writing table that was too large for the space, and looked, in consequence, like someone who had won a piece of furniture without being certain it was the right one. The man's name, she was told, was the Duke of Fenwick. He did not rise when she entered. He did not look up immediately. He permitted himself to do both of those things after a silence that had been precisely calibrated, and when he did look at her, his expression contained the assessment of a person who had already drawn his conclusions and was now simply checking that the facts obliged him. His name was Sebastian Fenwick, 6th Duke of that title, and he was the executor of the Ashmore estate and the chairman of the trust that had engaged her. She knew these things because she had been sent a brief. She knew one additional thing the brief had not contained, that his late cousin, the 5th Lord Ashmore, had owed a considerable sum to the Fenwick family, and that the sale of this house would retire a portion of that debt. She knew this because Charlotte Vale read deeds and conveyancing records the way other people read correspondence. It was a professional habit. She had mentioned none of it to Prentice in the car. "Miss Vale," said the Duke, and the 2 words carried the specific weight of a man who believed names to be administrative rather than personal. "Prentice tells me you come recommended." He paused. "Recommended," he said again, in a slightly different register, as though the word had been shown to him a second time, and he was still not certain he trusted it. "I am told you specialize in the contents of large country houses." "I do," Charlotte said. "Furniture, silver, ceramics, paintings, books, and documentary holdings. I produce probate valuations, insurance schedules, and sale catalogs. I work alone, and my reports are admissible in court." Sebastian Fenwick folded his hands. He had the quality of a man who kept everything contained within his own perimeter, whose very posture communicated that the space immediately around him was controlled territory. He looked at her with the expression people reserve for small, quiet animals they expect to find domesticated. "Prentice will give you access to the main rooms," he said. "Certain areas are sealed." "I noted that," Charlotte said. She did not offer a view on it. She held her clipboard against her ribs and looked back at him with the particular stillness of a person who has learned that composure, in a room full of people who hold authority, is the only instrument that cannot be confiscated. It was the wrong decision to mistake that stillness for deference. He would not understand for some time how wrong it was. I am so glad you are still with me. This story is about a woman who walked into a house and found that every lie in it had been made to look like administration. It is about what is hidden when someone powerful says certain areas are sealed, and it is about the kind of man who confuses control with understanding, and what happens when he meets someone he cannot contain. I would love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better? And if this is the sort of story that settles something in you, please do subscribe. There is more like this to come. Charlotte did not try the sealed rooms that night. She did other things first, because that was how she worked, systematically, from the perimeter inward, establishing the known condition of a thing before she examined the concealed one. She began in the entrance hall, which had been emptied of its portable contents but still held two pieces too large to remove without considerable effort. A cedar-lined cabinet of Flemish manufacture that stood nearly 8 feet high, and a gilt wood console of the William and Mary period, whose marble top was chipped at the left corner, in a way that reduced its insurance value by roughly a third. She moved from room to room with her clipboard and her notebook and a small flashlight, and she catalogued proportions, materials, condition, provenance where visible, maker's marks on the hardware, water damage to the plaster where the roof had let in moisture through the east wing guttering. She worked in the manner of someone for whom thoroughness is not effort but simply the natural shape of attention. By 7 in the evening she had covered 11 rooms. By 8 she had covered 14. The housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Tench, who had been caretaking the property for 2.5 years without being asked for her opinion on anything, had left her a cold supper in the kitchen on a tray. Charlotte ate it standing at the kitchen table, reading through the house's existing insurance schedule, which had last been updated in the spring of 4 years prior, and which contained errors significant enough to be professionally interesting. A William III walnut long-case clock had been listed as 18th century rather than late 17th. A set of 12 silver-gilt dessert forks attributed in the schedule to a London silversmith of the 1780s bore, on closer inspection, a hallmark she had read that afternoon that placed them squarely in Edinburgh, 1771, under a maker whose work commanded a premium. Neither error was accidental, in the strict sense. Both were the kind of error that required a prior assessment to have been conducted by someone who either did not know what they were looking at or had been paid not to. Charlotte placed a small asterisk beside each entry, closed the schedule, and set her fork down. She then went upstairs, down the east corridor, and opened the sealed room. The door was not locked. It had been sealed with wax over the latch plate, a red wax bearing the impression of a signet ring, in a style she did not recognize as the Ashmore crest, pressed there as though formality were sufficient deterrence. Charlotte studied the seal for a moment. She carried a small folding knife in her appraisal kit because paper seals on old documents could sometimes be lifted and preserved with the right tool, and she had on more than one occasion been asked to assess whether a wax seal was itself of historical value. She applied the knife to the edge of the wax with the delicacy of someone who had been trained never to destroy evidence before she had understood what it was evidence of. The seal came away intact. She pressed it flat between 2 pages of her notebook and opened the door. The room smelled of beeswax and old paper and something faintly sweet that she could not immediately identify. It was smaller than she had expected from the corridor proportions, a dressing room or withdrawing room that had been converted, at some point, into a holding space for domestic archives. There were shelves along 2 walls and a central table on which boxes had been stacked with the care of someone who intended to return to them. Charlotte stood in the doorway and looked. She did not enter at once. She read the room from its threshold the way she always read a new space, from the ceiling down, from the perimeter in, noting what was present and what was conspicuously absent, and what had been placed in a manner suggesting something other than neutral storage. There were ledger books, bound in red cloth, of the kind used for domestic household accounts. There was a tin dispatch box with the Ashmore name stamped on its lid. There was a row of personal correspondence files in green board covers, and there was a small oil painting, no larger than a sheet of writing paper, hung on the wall between the two shelving units, depicting a woman of perhaps 35 in the costume of the 1840s, whose expression contained a thing Charlotte recognized from long experience, the look of a person who has been asked to remain still and has complied, but has not been asked to look pleased about it. Charlotte stepped inside. She set her clipboard on the central table and began to read. The story must go backward before it can continue forward. This is not a deviation. It is the necessary thing. A person does not arrive at a sealed room in a house like Ashmore Park without having been made into the kind of person who opens doors that other people have decided should remain closed. And the making of Charlotte Vale took place over a considerable number of years, and in circumstances that would have produced a different result in someone less constitutionally resistant to the thing that happens to a person when authority takes something that belongs to them. Charlotte had been born in Shropshire, the second daughter of a woman who had worked all her life as a cataloguer for a county auction house, and a father who had repaired clocks and small mechanical instruments in a workshop at the back of the family house. Both were dead now, her father first in Charlotte's 12th year, and her mother when Charlotte was 26, which was the year Charlotte had been partway through an apprenticeship at a London firm of estate appraisers and valuers, and had therefore missed the period of mourning that grief might have entitled her to, because she had been in Wiltshire for 11 consecutive weeks assessing the contents of a house far larger than this one, for a client who required the work done before Christmas. She had learned the trade from the bottom. She had learned to identify a chair from its back feet before she could see its face, to date silver by the form of its hallmarks before she could read them clearly, to detect a relined canvas by the change in craquelure at the edges, and to identify the particular quality of old gilt that has been overcleaned as distinct from the particular quality of gilt that is simply aged without interference. She had learned cartouche identification and condition reporting, the language of the furniture historian and the practicing conservator both, and she had learned, most usefully, that the documents inside a house tell the true history of the house in ways that the furniture alone cannot, because furniture can be moved and relabeled and misrepresented, but an unexamined ledger is simply a ledger, and it says what it says. She had left the London firm after 6 years, not because she had been asked to leave, but because a senior partner had attributed 3 valuations, including a sequence on 17th-century Flemish cabinet work that had taken her 4 months, to a male colleague whose name appeared on the client report and who had contributed to it in the sense that he had approved it. She had not shouted. She had not wept at work. She had waited until she had accumulated enough private commissions to sustain herself, and then she had written a letter of resignation that contained 8 sentences, of which the first was courteous, the last was terminal, and the middle 6 were a precise accounting of the work that had been misattributed, with dates, case numbers, and client names. The senior partner had sent a response suggesting that her perception of events did not accord with the firm's records. This was perhaps the most useful thing he had ever done for her, because it confirmed the one principle that governed her professional life from that moment forward, that records must be kept in every direction, privately, comprehensively, and without the assumption that they will ever be needed, because the moment they are needed, they become the entire argument. She had kept her own records. She always would. There were 3 other things worth noting about Charlotte Vale's history, each of which bore on what she would find in the sealed room at Ashmore Park, and on what she would do with it. The first was that her grandmother had worked in domestic service at a house in the north of England, and had spent 40 years in the service of a family who had, when the estate was finally broken up and sold, awarded their upper servants a letter of thanks, and their lower servants nothing. Charlotte had heard this story twice, once as a child and once as an adult, and on both occasions her grandmother had delivered it in the manner of a person reporting a weather event rather than a grievance, without editorializing, without self-pity, and without any suggestion that it could have been different, because at the time of its occurrence it could not. Charlotte had stored the story in the same column where she stored the things she intended to act upon. The second thing was that she had been formally engaged to a man for 11 months in her early 30s, a man who was also in the antiquities trade, and who had at the end of those 11 months declined to marry her on the grounds that her work made her, as he had said with considerable finesse, difficult to accommodate. Charlotte had not argued the point. She had returned the ring, retrieved her field notebooks from his flat, and spoken of it to no one. The third thing was that she had, in her 11 years of practice, been engaged to assess 4 houses where she had subsequently discovered evidence of financial irregularity in the household accounts. On 3 of those 4 occasions, the irregularities had been reported to the relevant party. The relevant party had acted on them, and Charlotte had been paid in full and thanked. On the 4th occasion, the irregularity had involved the relevant party himself, and she had been asked, by a solicitor speaking on his behalf, to amend her report. She had not amended it. She had, instead, filed a copy with the appropriate professional body and provided the original to the counterparty in the transaction. That case had resolved in a manner that cost the relevant party considerably more than it would have cost him to pay her fee and accept her findings. She had noted this in her professional diary under the heading of outcomes, in the same spare shorthand she used for everything, and she had moved to the next commission. She was, in short, the exact wrong person to have been sent to Ashmore Park by a trust that had been maintaining falsified records for years. No one at the trust had understood this, because no one at the trust had read her file with any attention. Prentice had looked at her name on a list of approved appraisers and had selected her in the way that people select names from a list when they do not expect the selection to matter. The village of Ashmore Cross held one public house, a post office that was open on alternate mornings, a forge that had been converted to a tool hire business, and a community of approximately 40 households who had watched the Ashmore estate shrink over the preceding 2 decades, with the particular unsentimental attention that agricultural communities reserve for the gradual failure of large neighbors. Mrs. Tench, who caretaking the house, had grown up in the village and was known there by her maiden name of Dolly Briggs, and when it became known, within 3 days of Charlotte's arrival, that a woman from London had been sent to inventory the house, Mrs. Tench was the first to be asked whether the woman seemed competent. Mrs. Tench said that she had not eaten her supper warm on any of the first 4 evenings, which, as anyone who knew Mrs. Tench would understand, was confirmation of competence as rigorous as any professional credential. The village received this information and considered it, and then did largely nothing with it, because the history of the Ashmore estate and the village's relationship to it was long and had not recently been characterized by generosity in any direction, and the instinct for collaborative action had been discouraged for long enough that it had become, in most people, more of a memory of an instinct than the thing itself. There was one exception. His name was Hartley. He was 73, had been a tenant farmer on Ashmore land for 40 years, and had had his lease renewed each time, on terms that were, he said, exactly fair, which was his highest adjective. He had a habit of leaning against whatever was nearest to him with the unhurried ease of a man who had made peace with the amount of time things take. He walked across the field and knocked on the estate kitchen door on Charlotte's 5th morning at Ashmore Park, and when she answered it, he said, without preliminary, "You the one counting the rooms?" It was not a question. "I am," Charlotte said. "There's a ledger in the village hall," Hartley said. "The old one, for the estate accounts. Before they brought in the new system, I thought you might want to see it." Charlotte looked at him. "Why would it be in the village hall?" she said. "Because the old steward left it there on purpose," Hartley said, "the year before he died." He said this in the manner of someone delivering a verdict that had been several years in preparation, and then he leaned against the doorframe and waited to see what she would do with it. Charlotte went to the village hall that afternoon. The ledger was in a wooden box under the stage, behind a set of curtains that had last been laundered when they still smelled of something. The box was labeled in a hand she did not recognize, in ink that had aged to brown, and the label read, "Ashmore Estate, Domestic Accounts, 1987 to 2003, F. Gould, Steward." Inside, the ledger was intact, its pages dense with the close handwriting of a man who had been, she could tell from the first page alone, meticulous in the way that people are meticulous when they suspect they will eventually need evidence. She carried it back to the house in her appraisal bag. She did not tell Prentice. She set it beside the ledgers from the sealed room, spread the two sequences side by side on the central table under the window that faced the kitchen garden, and she began to read across the years. The Gould ledger recorded outgoings for works to the estate, for repairs and purchases and maintenance items, at figures that were plausible, careful, and consistent with the period. The ledgers from the sealed room, which bore the name of a subsequent steward called Neville, recorded the same categories of expenditure at figures which were, in the aggregate, approximately 31% higher, without any corresponding evidence in the physical structure of the house that the additional work had been done. The difference was not, Charlotte noted, the kind of difference that is produced by incompetence. It had a shape. It had been going on since 2004, which was 1 year after Gould had retired, and it had stopped in the year of the late Lord Ashmore's death, which was 3 years ago, not because it had been resolved, but because the person doing it had apparently decided that the transition of the estate to trust administration made continuation impractical. She opened her notebook and began with the numbers. Every line she wrote was a rectangle of provenance, the appraiser's word for the documented history of where a thing has been and who has owned it, extended here to cover not objects but money, where it had gone, who had said it went there, and what could be shown to be false about that account. She did not shout. She did not send an urgent message to London. She wrote for 2 hours in the quiet room above the kitchen garden, and then she went downstairs and told Mrs. Tench she would take her supper warm tonight, if it was not too much trouble. "If you are still here, and the room is quiet around you, I am grateful for your company." This kind of story does not rush toward its ending, because the work Charlotte is doing will not be rushed, and the ending will not mean what it should mean unless the ground has been fully prepared. The ledgers are open, the numbers do not balance, and something larger than a clerical error is about to come fully into the light. If you have been watching since the beginning, I hope you will subscribe so that none of these stories reaches you after the fact. And now, back to Ashmore Park, in the first week of December, when the Duke of Fenwick arrived without announcement and found Charlotte in the sealed room. Sebastian Fenwick arrived on a Tuesday. The house was cold. The underfloor heating in the east wing had failed on the previous Friday, and the morning was the kind of pale pewter gray that carries no warmth even when the sun nominally appears. He had driven himself, without Prentice, and he stood in the entrance hall for a moment before Charlotte came downstairs, and in that moment she observed him from the landing in a way that was not possible to describe as surveillance and yet functioned as surveillance. She saw a man who held himself as though the air immediately around him were something he had organized, who looked at the cedar cabinet by the far wall with the expression of someone accounting for the presence of a known quantity, and who had evidently not expected to find the house in the condition of quiet, systematic occupation in which he found it. There were her file boxes, stacked along the skirting of the entrance hall in the manner of someone who had already moved into the work rather than preparing to begin it. There was a completed furniture schedule clipped to the cabinet itself, in her own hand, with its date and reference number and condition notation. Sebastian looked at it for a moment before Charlotte came down the stairs. "Your report was due at the end of the month," he said. "The preliminary assessment will be complete by the end of the week," Charlotte said. "The documentary holdings will take longer." "What documentary holdings?" "The ones in the room at the end of the east corridor," Charlotte said. "The sealed room." He turned. The turn was controlled, but it was, she noted, slightly faster than his other movements, which suggested that the information had arrived in advance of his preparation for it. "That room was sealed by my direction," he said. "It was. The seal was a wax impression over the latch plate, which is a proprietary, not a legal seal. I preserved the wax for your inspection." She produced it from her notebook and set it on the console table between them. Sebastian looked at the small, careful rectangle of wax lying between two pieces of cardstock. He looked at it for a long moment. "That room is not part of the commission," he said. "The commission is to produce a complete and accurate inventory of the estate and its contents for the purposes of sale. I am not able to produce a complete inventory that excludes 2 of the 49 rooms." He was quiet. He was very good at being quiet. It was a practiced quality, the kind of stillness that is not natural ease but acquired control, and Charlotte had seen it before in people who had learned early that silence could be used as a weight. She was not moved by it, because she had her own kind of stillness, and hers was not acquired. He said, 2 rooms. "One was a linen store," Charlotte said. "Nothing of consequence." Another silence. Sebastian looked at her across the width of the entrance hall, and something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, not respect, not yet, but the particular adjustment of a person who has misjudged the gradient of the ground they are standing on, and is reassessing their footing. "What did you find?" he said, and for the first time he asked rather than stated. Charlotte turned and walked back toward the stairs. "Come and see," she said. He followed her. She had laid out the ledgers on the central table in the sequence she had established. The Gould ledger on the left, Neville's accounts on the right, and between them a working sheet in her own hand on which she had transcribed 43 line items as comparison pairs, with the variance in each, and the cumulative total at the bottom of the column. The room was cold and the light from the window was gray, and the papers were laid out with the precision of someone who had arranged evidence before. Sebastian came to the table and looked. He did not touch anything. He read for a long time, longer than Charlotte had expected, which told her something useful about the quality of his attention when it was genuinely engaged. She waited. She was very good at waiting. "Neville," he said, not as a question. "He was steward here from 2004 until the estate went to trust administration," Charlotte said. "He was retired by the trust on the grounds of age. He received a pension." Sebastian's jaw was set in the manner of someone holding a response inside their teeth. "How much?" he said. Charlotte pointed to the figure at the bottom of her working sheet. Sebastian looked at it. "This is over the course of 18 years, she said. "The annual variance is modest. It was designed to be modest." "Designed," he said. "The pattern is consistent. The amounts increase slightly in years when large capital works were being done elsewhere on the estate, when the additional expenditure would be less visible. They decrease in years when the accounts receive closer scrutiny, specifically in 2009 and 2014, which were the years of the 2 formal estate audits. That requires a working knowledge of when scrutiny is forthcoming." Sebastian put one hand flat on the table, not on the papers but beside them, and he stood in this position for a moment. He looked at the comparison sheet with the particular focus of a man who was recalibrating something he had believed settled. "You found this in 5 days, he said. "I found the structural pattern in 5 days, Charlotte said. A complete forensic account will take longer." He looked at her, not at the papers, at her. It was the first time he had looked at her in the manner of a person who is trying to understand something, rather than the manner of a person who has already understood everything and is merely confirming details. Charlotte met his gaze. She did not look away, and she did not modulate her expression to make the moment easier for him, because the moment was what it was, and it did not need her assistance. "What else?" he said. "I would prefer to have the complete picture before I present findings," Charlotte said. "I will have a preliminary report ready by Friday." "Send it directly to me," Sebastian said. "Not to Prentice." Charlotte noted this. She made no comment on it. She said, "The oil painting on the wall behind you is a portrait of Eliza Ashmore, née Hartley, who married the 3rd Lord Ashmore in 1847. It has not appeared in any insurance schedule of the house since 1998. She is the grandmother of the man who brought me the Gould ledger." Sebastian turned to look at the small painting. The woman in it looked back at both of them with the same composed expression she had always had. The silence in the room had a different quality now than it had had when Sebastian entered it. It was, Charlotte thought, the silence of a space in which something that had been wrongly categorized had been correctly identified at last. The report Charlotte sent to Sebastian on Friday evening was 31 pages. It was written in the register of her profession, precise, categorical, unembellished, the product of 11 years of training in the preparation of valuation reports, insurance schedules, and documentary evidence for legal and commercial purposes. It began with a summary of the estate's physical contents, assessed at current market value, with notations on condition and recommended conservation measures. It continued with the comparison of the 2 ledger sequences, annotated with reference to the specific categories of expenditure that showed variance, the years in which the variance was most pronounced, and a calculation of the total discrepancy over the period 2004 to the present. It then included a section which Charlotte had written with particular care on the documentary holdings of the sealed room themselves, their composition, their condition, their legal standing as estate records, and the recommendation that they be transferred to professional archival custody before any sale was concluded. The final section, which was the one she had spent the longest time writing, not because it was the most complex but because she was aware that its implications were significant, was a note on provenance and attribution concerning 14 items in the house's contents that had been listed in the existing insurance schedule under descriptions that did not accord with her assessment. Of these 14 items, 7 had been undervalued and 7 had been overvalued, and the pattern of valuation was not random. The undervalued items were portable, the kind of objects that could be removed from an estate without immediate notice, while the overvalued items were fixed, architectural, or otherwise difficult to remove, creating a schedule in which the insured value of the house appeared substantially higher than the true value of its movable contents. This was a technique she had seen before. It was not clumsiness. It was the work of someone who understood that an insurance payout on a house contents policy is calculated against the schedule on file, and that a schedule skewed in this particular direction serves the interests of the person who produces it, rather than the estate that employs them. She noted this in the report without attributing motive, because her role was to establish what the documents showed, and not to convict. She sent the report to Sebastian at 9:30 on Friday evening. He acknowledged receipt by return, in a message that contained 1 sentence and was not Prentice filtered. He was at Ashmore Park the following morning at 7. Sebastian arrived alone, again without Prentice, and he sat down at the table in the estate study, where Charlotte had arranged the working papers, and he read the report from beginning to end while she waited, which took 40 minutes, during which time she went to the kitchen, helped Mrs. Tench with the morning fire, and was given a cup of tea that was exactly the right temperature, which was the domestic equivalent of a professional commendation. When she returned to the study, Sebastian was on the final section. He read it twice. He then set the report down and held his hands flat on the table for a moment, and Charlotte observed, in the particular quality of that flatness, something she had not expected to observe in him so soon. Not calculation, not the management of consequences, but something simpler and less comfortable. He was, she understood, confronting the fact that his own trust had failed in its duty to the estate, not because of anything he himself had done, but because of what had not been asked. This commission was not properly specified, he said. No, Charlotte said. The brief asked for an inventory for sale purposes. It did not ask for an audit, which means whoever specified the brief either did not know what they were doing or did not want what you have found, Sebastian said. That is a question I am not qualified to answer, Charlotte said. It is a question for you. Another silence. He was looking at the comparison sheet, at the 43 line items, at the figure at the bottom of the column. He said, "Why did you open the sealed room?" Charlotte considered this. "Because it was sealed," she said. The answer, which was exact, produced something in his expression that was as close to a smile as she had yet seen from him. Not a wide thing, not a thing he permitted to complete itself, but the beginning of one, arrested and then composed again. He said, "I would like to engage your firm for the full forensic assessment." "I work alone," Charlotte said. "I know," he said. "I know that now." The report lay between them on the table, its 31 pages organized and flagged and cross-referenced. The whole weight of what Neville had done rendered in the plain, accurate language of Charlotte's discipline, and it was, she thought, the most complete thing she had produced in 11 years of practice, not because it was the most complex, but because it had been produced in the right conditions, which were the conditions of no one telling her where to look or where not to. Sebastian reached for his pen. He signed the extended engagement letter that she had prepared and left folded beside the report, and he did it without reading the terms again, which was either an unusual degree of trust or a very different kind of calculation. Charlotte was not yet certain which. She suspected she would find out. The formal reckoning with Neville was not dramatic. Dramatic is the wrong word for what it was. It was administrative, procedural, and in the structural sense, permanent. Charlotte's forensic report, which took 6 further weeks to complete and ran to 112 pages including appendices, was delivered to the trust solicitors in January. The solicitors engaged an independent forensic accountant to review it. The forensic accountant's findings, which took 3 weeks and cost the trust considerably less than the discrepancy it documented, confirmed Charlotte's analysis in every material respect and extended it in several. Neville, who was at this point 71 years of age and living in a retirement cottage in Dorset that had been provided to him as part of his pension arrangement, received a letter from the trust solicitors on the first day of February. The letter was, by all accounts, formal and measured in its language, though no one who was not Neville or his solicitor was in the room when he read it. What was known, because it became part of the public record, was that he did not contest the findings. He entered into a repayment arrangement. The pension cottage was sold as part of the settlement. The amounts recovered did not represent the total discrepancy, because some portion was irrecoverable, as is often the case with this kind of fraud when it is discovered after the fact, but the amounts recovered were substantial. The trust used a portion of them to fund conservation work on the east wing roof, which had been neglected precisely because the maintenance budget had been systematically depleted, and a further portion to establish a small endowment for the archiving of the estate's documentary holdings, which Charlotte had recommended be transferred to the county record office. She attended the initial transfer meeting at the record office in March, at which point the Gould ledger, which Hartley had kept in the wooden box under the village hall stage for 19 years, was added to the deposit as a donated item, with a note recording the name of its donor. Charlotte noted this. She said nothing in particular about it. Hartley, who had been invited to the meeting by virtue of being the donor, stood against the wall of the record office with his hands in his jacket pockets, in the manner of a man who had simply been waiting for the appropriate moment to give something back to the place it belonged. The insurance schedule had to be rewritten entirely. Charlotte did this, in the third week of January, in the sealed room, which was no longer sealed and which she had decided, on the grounds that it had the best light in the east wing, to use as her working office for the duration of the commission. She worked through the 14 items that had been misvalued, establishing correct attribution and condition for each. The 7 undervalued portable objects included the set of silver gilt forks, whose Edinburgh hallmark and actual maker's mark she had read correctly on her first afternoon, and which were worth, in the current market, nearly 3 times their scheduled value. The oil portrait of Eliza Ashmore, née Hartley, which had dropped from the schedules entirely, was attributed to a minor portrait painter of the 1840s, whose work was not remarkable in itself, but whose subject was, given the documentary record, of local historical significance. Charlotte recommended it be retained by the estate rather than sold. It was. She completed the schedule in 6 days, with the thoroughness she applied to everything, and she delivered it to Sebastian on a Thursday afternoon, in late January, when he had driven down from London specifically to review the documentation before it went to the insurers. He came to the working room rather than the study. He had been doing this since November, presenting himself at the room where the work was, rather than requiring the work to be brought to him, which Charlotte noted and did not comment on. He reviewed the schedule standing at the table where the evidence was still laid out, and at one point he asked her a question about the method of cartouche identification on the forks, and she explained it, correctly and precisely, and he listened without interrupting, and when she had finished he said, "You knew from the first afternoon." "I noted it," Charlotte said. "You said nothing." "I had not yet established what it was evidence of," Charlotte said. "I do not present a finding before I understand what it is a finding about." He looked at her in the manner he had been developing over the preceding weeks, which was the manner not of a man assessing an asset, but of a man trying to understand something he had not expected to find, and was not certain, yet, what to do with. He said, "I was wrong about why you had been sent." "You were wrong about who I was," Charlotte said. She said it without reproach. It was a fact, not an accusation, and she delivered it in the same register she used for everything. Sebastian was quiet for a moment. He looked at the schedule, at the portrait of Eliza Ashmore on the wall, at the 2 ledgers still side by side on the table. He said yes. Just that. 1 word. Charlotte recorded it in no notebook. She set her pen down beside the schedule and looked at the portrait for a moment, at the composed woman who had been sitting in the same posture in the same light for nearly 200 years, and she thought that there was something, between the particular quality of that composure and the particular quality of the silence in this room, that her grandmother would have understood and approved of. Sebastian reached for the schedule. His hand passed close to hers on the table. Neither of them moved. The window above the kitchen garden showed the sky of late January, which was pale and very still, and held the faint suggestion of a change in the weather. The house sold in April. It sold at its correct value, which was, after the restoration of the accurate insurance schedule and the recovery of a portion of the underpaid maintenance, somewhat above the figure the trust had initially projected. The endowment for the archival deposit was established. The east wing roof was repaired. The portrait of Eliza Ashmore was reinstalled in the entrance hall, where it had not hung since 1998, in the space between the 2 east windows, where the light fell on it in a way that made the expression of the woman in it look, if anything, slightly less burdened. Mrs. Tench continued as caretaker for the new owners, who were, it turned out, precisely the kind of people who appreciated a cold supper left on a tray, with exactness and without commentary. Hartley walked home across his fields and watched the repair of the east wing roof from a distance, and said nothing particular about it to anyone, which was his way of saying everything. Charlotte completed her final report, 94 pages with appendices, in the 3rd week of April, and she delivered it in person to Sebastian's office in London on a Wednesday morning, which was a journey she need not have made in person, given that she could have sent it by courier, and which Sebastian received in person rather than instructing his secretary to accept it, which was a fact neither of them named. He asked her if she would take coffee. She said she would. They sat on either side of his desk in the manner of two people who have established over a period of months a way of being in a room together that is comfortable without yet having been named. And he said, "What will you do now?" And she said, "There is always another house." He said, "I have 3 estates administered by this trust." She said, "I know." A silence settled between them that was not uncomfortable. He looked at his hands on the desk, and then he looked at her, and she thought that the quality of his attention, which had been, in November, the attention of a man assessing a resource, had become something she found it harder to classify. She did not try to classify it. She drank her coffee. Outside the office window, London was doing what London does in April, managing its weather with the quiet industriousness of a city that has long since made its peace with impermanence. The aphorism she had heard Hartley say on her 5th day at Ashmore Park, when she had asked him why he had kept the ledger for 19 years, came back to her now. A thing that is honestly accounted for does not stay lost. It had been his grandmother's saying, he told her, which meant it had been Eliza Ashmore's saying first, and it had made its way across 6 generations and 1 sealed room to arrive here, in this specific January, in the mouth of a man leaning against a doorframe in the early morning, offering it to a person he had not yet assessed, and was offering it to anyway, on faith. Sebastian said, "The first estate. You would start in June, if it suited you." Charlotte set her cup down. She said, "It would suit me." The morning light came through the window and lay across the desk between them, and the stack of 94 pages rested there, and neither of them moved to put them away, because the work was finished, but the room was not empty, and that was, she thought, a kind of beginning. A thing that is honestly accounted for does not stay lost. Thank you for spending this evening at Ashmore Park, and for staying all the way to the end of this story. I hope the quiet of it settled somewhere. If you would like to leave a comment, I would be very glad to know where in the world you are watching from tonight, and whether this kind of story, the kind that trusts a woman to do her work correctly and trusts you to be patient while she does it, is the kind that finds something in you. Your comments are read, every one of them. If you have not yet subscribed to this channel, I would be grateful if you would, because there are more of these stories and I would like them to reach you. And one last question to carry with you. Is there something in your own life, a room that was sealed, a number that did not quite add up, a skill that was overlooked, that you have been waiting for the right moment to open and account for? Some things wait a long time to be seen correctly. They do not, in the end, stay lost.